And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. This picture has just been transmitted by wire. It is a picture taken just a moment or two before the incident. If you can zoom in with that camera, we can get a closer look at this picture. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
That would resemble royalty is the Kennedy family. John Kennedy, widely considered America's president, is often used by other presidents when talking about civil rights and standing up for what you believe in. But behind those doors was one of the most adulterous presidents in the United States history. His associations with mobsters and movie stars aside, John Kennedy got to sort of get where he got, not by necessarily hard work or luck, but by using the system against itself and using those long-term associations of his father, Joe, to get himself into the White House. It's also those things, those associations, that got him killed as well. As an American government who was not comfortable with African Americans having a voice. Those are just the facts. And there's a lot of reasons as to why John F. Kennedy was murdered by his own government, and conspiracy theories aside, the American love affair with the Kennedys likely is never going to end. The mystique of the Kennedys is one thing, but what took place behind closed doors, which you'll learn about, is nothing short of fucking insane. And when we talk about the Kennedys, we also think about, big American family names like the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and the list goes on and on and on. All of these families were warmongers. They were anti-Semites, and they are who and still control this country. Just the bottom line. The Kennedys were no different in that sort of regard. Behind every great financial success is a crime, and this family legacy is tattered in criminality. And I want everybody to understand this is in no way, shape, or form a blasphemous topic. What you can expect from this series is an in-depth look into the financial wealth of the family, how they got their start, and how they acquired their wealth, and the seedier things that they did behind the scenes to acquire that power. Their story is no different from many others before them or after them. But because of their political power and the ability to skate from about everything is going to be the main focus of this series. We aren't going to jump into the deep end. If you're expecting me to cover every single facet of every single member, we're not going to do that. The main focus of this series will be to show you their organized crime ties and how they availed of themselves the government to clear up their problems. And they can only do that through absolute power. It's not to make them look bad, because in reality, 90% of us in the same position would use our power to wield it at our direction. And the Kennedys were no different in that regard. In terms of the Kennedy assassination, we're not going to jump into all the conspiracies. I refuse to. What is important is that we draw a line or a correlation between organized crime and the Kennedys. For instance, Jack Ruby. He was a mob clubhouse operator. He was a known mob guy. Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle was a gangster who was tight with Jack Ruby and other Midwest gangsters. Where we can draw a direct line, we will. If you're looking for Dealey Plaza discussions about the magic bullet, we're not going to be talking about that. However, we will be discussing what Kennedy did to infuriate the very men who got him elected and the ramifications of allowing his brother Bobby to go on a public witch hunt against those who got him elected. And I'll tell you straight out of the gate. No, I'm not going to pull the wool over your eyes. Straight out of the gate, the Mafia did not kill John F. Kennedy. They did not. Rather, they were involved in it to some degree, and they helped facilitate it. I don't care what authors' perspectives are. The bottom line for me has always been, when people get you elected and you turn on them, you are giving them every reason to go after you. And when your past shows your deep connections to organized crime, it doesn't take rocket science to see it for what it is. And so we start with a question. Could the mob, or did the mob, have the power to kill a United States president? And the answer is simple. No, they didn't. They didn't have the power to carry out that on their own, and that's what I mean, nor the sophistication for that. However, with help from, say, Lyndon Johnson, corrupt Secret Service agents, and the CIA, anything can be done. So what was, if anything, the role of the mob in the Kennedy assassination? And that's going to be a big topic that we cover in this next 10 shows. Names like Sinatra, Monroe, Peter Lawford, Sam Giancana, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, George Bush, Alan Dulles, Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jimmy Hoffa, Russell Buffalino. These are just some of the names that we're going to discuss in this series as it relates to the Kennedy family. This series is all about criminality. It's about how one family from their inception used criminality to attain wealth and power, and just as the family came into the zenith of that power, had their legs cut from underneath of them. With great power comes greater responsibility. And if the Kennedy curse is real, which I don't believe it to be, then everything that we are going to talk about will teach you that curses are jargon for men who make great mistakes. There is no mistake greater than upsetting someone much more powerful than yourself. John Kennedy learned that. Bobby Kennedy learned that. Joe Kennedy learned that. And Teddy, most importantly, learned that, which is why he never, ever tried to run as a serious contender to be president. He knew enough to just not fucking go certain places. And while Teddy had his own checkered past, I do think, and many of you may disagree with me, I think he was the most intelligent and the most honest Kennedy that there was, which is kind of saying something, but he was the brightest of the Kennedy brothers, the most decent one of them. But most importantly, he knew how to stay in his fucking lane. So it's not a curse, really, in all honesty, it's not. It's people that are more powerful putting those less powerful in their fucking place. So for those hoping for a complete dissection of the Kennedys, it's not going to be that way. We're going to cover most of the bases in terms of criminality and organized crime. And many may not like the stance that I will take. Many may not like the slight on the Kennedy name. But everything that we discuss on this show is backtracked and proven with FBI paperwork, a little bit of street logic, and facts. American authors have always put the Kennedys on some sort of imaginary pulpit, as if, especially John F. Kennedy, they act like he was the greatest American president we've ever had, but simply that's just not the truth. Listen, Bill Clinton got impeached for getting a blowjob in the Oral Office and lying at the Oral Office, the Oval, the Oval Office, and he got impeached for getting a blowjob and denying it. Meanwhile, Kennedy was fucking everything left and right in the Oval Office, and everybody knew, but nobody said a fucking word. This is a president who took drugs regularly, including acid, including marijuana. It was once in a hotel so fucked up on drugs, he was running around naked with hookers. And Secret Service agents had to hold him down and call a doctor. That was John F. Kennedy. Whether you believe it or not, that's accurate. And this was a man who wasn't living his own dreams and aspirations, but rather those of an overbearing racist and anti-Semitic father, whose dreams got dashed for his views and his support and his affiliation with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. If the father couldn't achieve his dreams, he would position his sons to achieve those for him. And those thoughts, those dreams, that pushing, also got his sons killed by the very foundation, the very organized crime group that runs this fucking country. To kill the snake, you chop off its head, but to stop a vendetta, you murder the children and the offspring. The only way to silence the crowd is by suffocating them. And with that being said, here we go. So to begin, we have to step back in time a little bit. The Fitzgerald family was from Ireland, specifically County Limerick and Bruff, Western Ireland. Between 1845 and 1855, some of the Fitzgerald clan left Ireland to escape the potato famine and arrived on American shores, settling in Boston, Massachusetts. Thomas Fitzgerald was born in Bruff, Ireland in 1823, and Rosanna Cox was born in County Cavan in 1835, and they were the parents of John Francis Fitzgerald, who was born in Boston in 1863. September 18th of 1889, John Francis Fitzgerald married Mary Josephine Hannon of Acton, Mass. She was the daughter of Michael Hannon and Mary Ann Fitzgerald, both born in Ireland. Their daughter, Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald, was born on July 22nd of 1890 in Boston, and she was the mother of soon-to-be President John F. Kennedy. During that same time period, the Fitzgeralds would begin migrating to America. Patrick Kennedy, who was a cooper, left Dunganstown County, Wexford, Ireland, and sailed for the United States. In 1849, he would marry Bridget Murphy, who was also born in Ireland, Wexford County, in 1827. 9 years later, she would be a widow with 4 children, the youngest of which was Patrick Joseph Kennedy, who would be John F. Kennedy's grandfather. Just kind of giving you a lineage here. In 1887, Patrick Kennedy would marry Augusta Hickey, daughter of James Hickey of Cork, Ireland. Their son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, was born September 6th of 1888 in East Boston and would be John F. Kennedy's daddy. I love saying that. So the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys had a rough start. You know, they lived and worked in Boston, but were, they put up with a lot of widespread bigotry against Irish Catholic immigrants. The early Kennedys and Fitzgeralds worked as peddlers, coopers, and common laborers. They would later become clerks, bar owners, and retailers. So by the end of the century, Patrick Kennedy and John Fitzgerald, who were JFK's maternal and paternal grandfathers, would both become Boston political heavyweights. John Fitzgerald would become the mayor of Boston twice and a member of Congress, and that's kind of where we begin. So Patrick Kennedy, also known as P.J. Kennedy, was born, and this is John F. Kennedy's grandfather, was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1848. He was the youngest of 5, born to Patrick Kennedy and Bridget Murphy. Both parents came over from Ireland. Like we said earlier, 10 months after Patrick was born, his father would die of an influenza type of epidemic, sort of like COVID, which was tearing through the East Boston neighborhood. Patrick, who was the only surviving male, was the only Kennedy to get a formal education. His mother, Bridget, used what money she had and opened a stationery store where she had worked for years. The business was slow going at first, but eventually would become very successful and would end up becoming a stationery store, a grocery store / liquor store as well. When Patrick, or PJ, was 14, he would choose to leave school to work at the store with his sisters, Mary, Joanna, and Margaret, and their mother. He would join them on the Boston docks and work as a stevedore for a short period of time. But basically, a stevedore is somebody who helped load and unload ships on the docks, basically a longshoreman type of deal. And PJ worked his ass off, and he saved every single penny he had. Money he made went not just to food for the family and for the home, but, he really just saved everything. And he worked and worked and worked. And eventually his mother, Bridget, helped him acquire a bar in Haymarket Square called Hayward's, which was between the north end of Boston and the government center. And he would purchase that bar in 1879 for $3,000. That's a lot of fucking money in 1879. As his business opened, it began slowly, but eventually became a successful one, and it allowed him to purchase another bar adjacent from the Boston docks, which actually was a great location because dock workers and laborers needed a place for downtime after their shift. So that place was, a basic beer hall. It appealed to blue-collar workers, and the prices were adjusted to recognize those efforts. So Patrick was smart in a way that he designed his business plan. Men who were smelly and dirty and worked all day were not looking for something upscale, but rather just a cool place to hang out and drink after work. And it became a successful and busy place as well. It was sort of the watering hole that everybody on the docks wanted to go, and ship captains loved to go there and drink. And Patrick, realizing that not only did he have a place between the North End and Center City, but he now had acquired a place adjacent from the docks, and he needed to venture out and serve drinks to a different clientele. So he had lower class, he had middle class, and now he's going to shoot for upper class. And what he does is he ends up purchasing another bar with a friend of his, and they call it, it was owned in a corporation called Kennedy and Quigley, and the upscale East Boston Hotel, which was aptly named the Maverick House. This bar was also a huge success, and the money was rolling in. He covered the upper, middle, and lower class with his establishments, and it was all successful. He was pretty much serving everybody, and the cash just continued to flow in. And it was actually located, the final bar, the Maverick House, which was in the hotel, was located right next to the War II Democratic headquarters, and that's going to be a very important thing. So not long after the Maverick started turning over big profits, he began sort of peering into liquor distributorships. What Patrick wanted to do was import liquor, specifically whiskey from other countries. And this would have been like 1873, 1874 at some point. And he would end up purchasing a whiskey importing business and then renaming it P.J. Kennedy Incorporation. And they would import whiskey and liquor from South America and from Europe. And the money just kept coming in. Smart business guy. So in 1887, Patrick would end up marrying a girl by the name of Mary Augusta Hickey. They would have 4 children, the first of which was Joseph Patrick Kennedy, the second Francis Benedict Kennedy, Mary Loretta Kennedy, and Margaret Louise Kennedy. PJ's business acumen was pretty precise, and he would end up purchasing his first home in Jeffreys Point, which was an affluent area in East Boston. And the area at the time was mixed ethnicity, but was really truly the pinnacle of the elite in Boston. PJ, who always looked out for his Irish counterparts, was known to loan money to others from Ireland looking to make a start in America. And basically, the nice term is he was loan sharking. And a lot of people will say that that's not the case, but the truth was he was. He was loan sharking, not at a high volume, but just enough to make more money. A friendly smile and a handshake just wasn't enough for PJ. It was about the bottom line, which was business and money. So as his business and his little empire begins to grow, so does the type of friendships that he begins to have. The days of bar crawling, local gossip were over for him. In his affluent neighborhood were the movers and the shakers of business. In the old days, it was about God and dock workers, right? And now he found himself in a circle where affluent businessmen were discussing politics, power, and prestige. And Kennedy wanted to be a part of that circle. Oops, sorry about that, guys. He wanted to be a part of that circle very badly. And to him, it represented opportunity. And while PJ was successful pretty much in every way, he wanted more. He wanted power. That's what he wanted. Kennedy was a popular guy amongst the elite, somebody who spoke of values, somebody who helped others that were less fortunate, even though it was loan sharking. Because of his popularity, friends began to think that he could be a great influence on local politics. Especially with the affluent friends that he had, they begin to sort of posture him towards maybe thinking about politics. And it was more about somebody they could control versus like him having merits or values, right? So they would preen him. Well, you got great values. You got great morals. This is what we want to do. But they saw in him somebody they could fucking control. It's something the rich wanted so they could get what they wanted. And that's all it was ever about. It was about, one of their own, a part of the affluent society controlling their narrative and the narrative of the rich. So in 1884, Kennedy decided that a political run might be the direction that he could go. And he had begun as a War II soldier as the captain of his voting precinct, a chair of the War II caucus, and he was charged with nominating Democratic candidates for Boston's Common Council as secretary of the Suffolk County Democratic Convention. So by 1885, PJ's political patrons decided that their loyal, well-connected soldier was ready for action. In 1885, when Grover Cleveland becomes the nation's first Democratic president in 28 years, it boded well for Boston Democrats, who later that year would put forth Hugh O'Brien, who was basically a wealthy newspaper guy and a former alderman, as a candidate for the mayor. O'Brien was elected as the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston, opening doors for other Irish candidates. And his route was well established. PJ just would end up making a name for himself, and he would actually run for common council. Now, in rare cases, he might aim for the more exclusive board of aldermen, but PJ opts for neither one of those. Instead of starting local, he looked past his island wards and set his sights on the State House in Beacon Hill, the historic home to the Massachusetts General Court that he had visited when he was a little kid in the heart of Brahmin, Boston. PJ was an earnest and hardworking guy, good with names and eager to help just the Irish. Our kind is in quotes because that's what he called them. The War II's Irish Catholics is what he meant. And he would meet with constituents and he would talk about his support for the labor movement. And that's very important because labor is organized crime, and we know where it goes from there. He favored the New East Boston soup kitchens, which fed the persistent flow of hungry incoming immigrants. He would use his popularity among all facets of society to parlay himself into service as a Democrat. And it was an odd move at the time, considering that the Massachusetts General Court Republicans were the majority. So he's going against the grain automatically, but he's using his Irish counterparts and the people he knows to get him in a good position. We call that back channeling. So on November 3rd of 1885, turnout was heavy in the Ward too. Voters crowded the streets and alleys around polling places, and most of them were within a block of PJ's bar, which was packed with PJ's precinct lieutenants and other ward soldiers. Polls would close at 8 p.m. that night, and the ballots trickled in until about 10. As the count began, with PJ's friend Nick Flynn, who was a ward secretary, who was tallying votes, one ward leader began taking bets, placing hundreds of dollars on PJ for the win. At 11:15, the results were announced. Kennedy had defeated the Republican in prohibition slates to become the new state representative for Ward 2. He had done it. He leapfrogged over everyone his age and older who had bigger, more experience, and people who had similar political aspirations. So you kind of got to look in between the lines here that there was probably some ballot tipping, if you catch my drift with this, because this is a guy who never ran for politics. He was a fucking Democrat, and he was an Irish Catholic. All three of those things with no experience. Those are four things that went against him, but somehow he beat out everybody his own age and older than him who had years and years of experience. Popularity is not enough. The problem is the rich get the votes. So I just read between the lines on that one. So on January 6th of 1886, a week before his 28th birthday, PJ actually gets sworn in as a member of the 107th Massachusetts General Court. Kennedy was a huge success, and he would serve 5 consecutive one-year terms in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, then 3 two-year terms in the upper chamber of the Massachusetts Senate. He would become the lead Democratic leader in Boston, and he quickly was becoming a political machine and a very powerful guy. And would end up going on giving a speech for Grover Cleveland at the 1888 National Convention in St. Louis. Now, while Kennedy was a political mover and shaker, he didn't like speeches. He hated legislation, and he didn't like social posturing at all. So he really didn't like anything about politics, but what he truly loved, what his specialty was, what he really enjoyed was backdoor dealing. He liked the seedier side of politics, and he loved nothing more than the backstabbing that went on, especially when it came at his hands. He loved digging up dirt on people. He loved embarrassing people. That was his thing. So like I said, nothing pleased him more than squashing somebody who thought that they had the goods on him. He was better at getting underhanded information on opponents than anybody else in Boston's history, and would become one of the best operatives to seek out when running for office because he had all the dirt on everybody, and that came with a hefty price tag. He was Roger Stone before Roger Stone ever became Roger Stone, if you need sort of an example. In 1895, he grew tired of politics and he stepped down from the general court, and he would spend the rest of his political career as an appointed elections commissioner. This is very important that you hear this, okay? I may read this twice. He would spend the rest of his fucking political career as an appointed elections commissioner, the city fire commissioner, the backroom boss of Boston's Ward 2, and the head of the Democratic Board of Strategy. I'm going to say this one more time. He's appointed the city elections commissioner, meaning he makes sure there's no vote cheating going on. He becomes the city fire commissioner, which means he has access and he has power to wield zoning and stuff like that and permits. The backroom boss of Boston's Ward 2. He's not in control. He's in control of Ward 2 politics. Okay? And the head of the Democratic Board of Strategy. Now, what I'm about to say to you is nothing that I can prove. There is nothing I can slam in front of you that would ever prove this. However, when you're in control of politics, when you're in control of elections control, when you control Ward 2, you control everything in that fucking city that moves. Kennedy wasn't about attaining mass wealth. Now, he would, but his main goal was fucking power. The power to control. And through that comes money, prestige, power, and wealth. With his money, he begins to venture out into stocks and bonds. He would buy into a coal company, Suffolk Coal Company, and he would buy a ton of stock in Columbia Trust Company, so much so that he controlled the majority of ownership in that company, and they name him VP of Columbia Trust. And this is something that his son Joe is going to go ahead and do years down the line. He would then begin buying up real estate, owning a huge portfolio of land and property. His legacy would be political power, and it enabled his wife and children to be raised without any of the trappings of other citizens. They were wealthy. They never wanted for anything. PJ would eventually be diagnosed with liver disease, and he would struggle with the disease itself, and he would be admitted to Deaconess Hospital in April of 1929, but would never really get any better, and in May he would pass away at the age of 71. Hundreds would line the streets to say goodbye to PJ Kennedy. He wouldn't be the last Kennedy to be publicly mourned in that fashion, as we know. What PJ had done in a relatively long life was build a foundation for a political dynasty and a uber wealthy family. So while PJ did some underhanded things, he did a lot of underhanded things. Business-wise, the bulk of his fortune, believe it or not, did come from hard work, but it also came from a lot of shady deals and a lot of backdoor dealing. But the majority of his wealth was established prior to his foray into politics. So the majority of his wealth in the beginning came from legit shit. The second half of his career, believe me when I tell you, politics afforded him opportunities other Irish people never had. So while PJ's wealth would take care of his children and wife, and it would enable them to have the very best, it was just the very beginning of the Kennedy dynasty. All PJ did was lay the groundwork and the foundation, and we talk on the show all the time about the foundation. PJ's son Joe would become a juggernaut of the Kennedy namesake and family, and would take them into infamy in a short period of time. What PJ was able to accomplish is really something to behold when you take everything into consideration. But what his son is about to do takes PJ's model, flips it on its fucking head. But Joe, as you will see, wasn't the hard worker that his father was. Joe knew the best way to accomplish power and wealth came from fucking people from behind. Backroom deals. It came from the seedy side of the fence. And Joe was willing to do whatever because Joe was about wealth and power. That's all he wanted. What was deep inside of Joe Kennedy's soul was power. He wanted to control everything. Narcissistic shit. He wanted to be a mover and shaker. He wanted to make the rules and enforce those rules. And he would be ruthless in his desires. While PJ might have lived in a gray area of outside the law, for the most part, he was a hardworking, ordinary citizen who whose business acumen and hard work paid off along with some seedier shit. But that wasn't the bulk of his life, so I don't want to label PJ a total criminal. His son, as you're going to see, wasn't cut from the same cloth. He would be dubious, evil, ruthless. And if the rules couldn't be bent, he would break them, and he would make new rules that only applied to him and his family. And so next week, when we do come back, it's the rise of Joe Kennedy. And whatever acumen his father had, Joe had it too. But Joe was willing to make deals with the most despicable characters on earth. But wealth and power came with being ruthless, utterly ruthless. And so when you look back on PJ's life, sure, of course, he's an Irish Catholic, never run for politics, makes good money doing pretty much legit shit for most of his life. But then he gets into the seedier side of politics, and then he controls the city. And so you can see sort of the character arc, like a TV show. And that's the reality of who PJ was. And the fact that he died when Joe was relatively young. Joe didn't really know his father, but he sure as fuck seemed to pick up everything he ever did and just turned it on its heels. And this wealth is how the Kennedys started. That's where the wealth begins. A lot of people may not know who PJ Kennedy is. I hope you learned something from that. But the reality is this is what starts the wealth. This is what starts the wealth of the Kennedy family, because who does it trickle down to? Well, it trickles down to Joe Kennedy. And Joe Kennedy was wealthy from pretty much the day he was born. But that wasn't enough. That amount of money wasn't enough. And so looking ahead, you're going to see Joe do something almost insane when he becomes a bank president and takes over the bank. He becomes a stock swindler, a drug dealer, a rum runner. He becomes the head of the Maritimes. When you are the head of the Maritimes, you control what ships go where, what the ships bring in. You have the power to control what comes in and what goes out. Can you see why Joe might be valuable to somebody like Lucky Luciano? Why he might be valuable to somebody like Costello? The rum running, the narcotics trafficking. When you control the ports, when you can control where ships go and what they do, by subterfuge, you can make sure nothing gets caught. And so there'll be a lot to discuss with Joe Kennedy. That's going to be a couple of weeks because there's so much when it comes to him. And this is the reason why I started off slow today, because I don't want to overlap you with a bunch of shit, but I wanted to show you how this began. PJ came to this, PJ's family, the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds came here with nothing. PJ's a smart guy, but he knows that being wealthy to some extent is great, but what's wealth with no power? And then you have the affluent people around you needling you to get involved in politics, not because they think you have some kind of moral ambiguity, but because they know you'll do what the rich want you to do. So it's a lesson he learns very quickly. And as we pointed out, he loved the seedier shit. When you control Ward 2, you can control who runs. When you are the voting commissioner, you control the votes. You can count who goes in and who goes out. Oh, let's just forget these 50,000 votes over here. Let's go with this guy. And if you think he didn't do that, you'd be wrong. Can I prove it? No. But I can tell you what happened. Irish Catholics couldn't win shit. Got to remember the time period you're dealing in. Irish were hated, especially Irish Catholics. My God. We've talked about that in relative terms in New York City, too. Tammany Hall and all kinds of stuff like that. How the Irish hated the Italians when they came, because all the Irish were doing is they had been bullied by everybody, so they in turn start to bully the Italians. And so it starts with simple hard work, leads into some sort of politics, then the backdoor dealing, the shady shit begins, and that's just going to filter right down to Joe. And Joe is going to take that and flip it so many fucking 6 ways from Sunday. Because Joe Kennedy was a criminal fuck. Like you have no idea. So come back next week. And we will start the discussion on Joe Kennedy. Feel free to email me and let me know what you think of the first show. We always start slow. Even when we do the Rizzuto's Catronis, we always start slow. So all that being said, have a great weekend, everybody. We will be back next week with more of the Kennedy crime family. And this episode is mainly going to be about bootlegging. It's one of the ways now, obviously, as many of you know, we talked last week about PJ Kennedy and sort of how he got his goddamn fucking neck. Sometimes, man, my neck is fucked. Hold on a second. All right, much better. It popped. But, you know, we know that PJ Kennedy really got his start working the hard, old-fashioned way, but it's through the upper crust of society that he begins to sort of make his move into politics. And through that came a lot of things and a lot of money and a lot of seedier sort of things that he did. And that's really how the Kennedys got their start financially. And so, like I said, we spoke about PJ Kennedy, his hard work, and it led to, like I said, the seedier parts of the Boston's upper crust of society. And while PJ did work hard, once he sort of established himself, his wealth and his friendships added another layer to his life. And it's a layer that would give him a little infamy, but also allow him to set up his children and his wife for life. And that's sort of where the Kennedy money begins to flow. And if you look back, this is exactly how the Kennedy family began. Its ascent into politics. And sort of how they got into the upper crust of Boston's most famous. So on May 18th of 1929, P.J. Kennedy would pass away, and most of his fortune would go to his wife and his children. Joseph Kennedy was born in Boston in September 6th of 1888. He was the son of Mary Hickey and P.J. Kennedy. And as we said last week, P.J. Kennedy had gained the majority of his wealth from insider politics and business and had basically taken over 2 financial institutions in Columbia Trust Company and Sumner Savings Bank. And having a controlling interest in 2 banks availed him different opportunities, and it basically allowed him to do legal loan sharking, okay? So when Joe Kennedy was growing up, he attended a lot of different Catholic schools, mainly Catholic schools in East Boston. He was a great student. He excelled in school, and so much so he was placed in Boston's Latin School, which was a college prep school within the Boston public school system. So while Joe succeeded in math, his Latin scores were absolutely horrible. He had an acumen for numbers, but zero acumen for any other languages. By all accounts, he was quiet, but a popular student among fellow students and teachers. He would be elected class president in his senior year of high school, and he would graduate Boston's Latin School in 1908 and would gain entrance into the prestigious Harvard University. He would receive his BA in 1912. In the fall of 1912, Joe would get a job to become assistant bank examiner for Massachusetts. It was a coveted state job, and he no doubt got it as a result, not so much for his skills or his acumen, but because of the friendships of his father. And that's something that Kennedys would excel at for the next generation. They're still doing it. And that was the first move for Joe into the financial business, which he would actually excel at, albeit from a darker, more seedier side. In the last few years at Harvard, he would meet Rose Fitzgerald, who was the daughter of then Boston Mayor John F. Honeyfitz Fitzgerald. Joe had long known Rose, and because his father PJ and John Fitzgerald were very close friends through the decades, and they were business associates, the 2 families would spend summers together on the beach. And in his teens, Joe would escort Rose to dances and parties. This was a match sort of in the making for several years. After Joe graduated, he began to court Rose more seriously. The couple would marry on October 7th of 1914. After their honeymoon, they would settle down in Brookline, Mass. Their first son, Joe Kennedy Jr., would be born a little more than a year later at their summer house in Hull, Massachusetts. And we talk all the time, especially about organized crime, right? about the marriage between two powerful families. And I cannot and will not question the idea of love here. But Sicilians in general have traditionally arranged marriages in this fashion. The Irish have done it. Many ethnicities have done that. Look at the marriage of Tommy Lucchese, between the marriage of Tommy Lucchese and Carlo Gambino. Tommy Gambino marries Tommy Lucchese's daughter. It was a power move between two families, and from my understanding, they loved each other very much. But the power that wielded from both men under one umbrella while being able to separate each other's rackets is a power move by any, doesn't matter what you say, it's a power move. Gambino would allow Lucchese to move into the ports and into the eastern seaboard and into the garment district. And in return, Lucchese cut Gambino in on the airports. And it's a move that helped propel both families financially and power-wise. So it's my opinion, but I think that was the strongest bond between the two bosses in history of organized crime, the one between Lucchese and Gambino. Remember, Lucchese backed Gambino when many wouldn't in those early days. And in fact, he had saved Carlo Gambino's life at least twice that we know of. Lucchese, during the Castellammarese War, could have fed Gambino to the wolves. He could have fed Gambino to the wolves many times, and he just didn't. He valued their friendship, and he was loyal to Gambino, just as Gambino would always be loyal to Tommy Lucchese. Those two together was a powerhouse, which is why Joe Bonanno went batshit crazy when they formed sort of that alliance, because he knew they would be unstoppable. The marriage between the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds was really no different. It was putting socialites together and two powerful men and two wealthy men together. So in 1913, Columbia Trust, which at the time was owned by Joe's father, PJ, was under the threat of a hostile takeover. Stockholders were close to selling off their shares, and Joe, recognizing the importance of owning a bank, begins to ask all of his wealthy friends and relatives for a loan to purchase the controlling interest of the bank. Now, what he ends up doing is borrowing $55,000, which in those days was $1.3 million. There's no way Joe is ever going to be able to accomplish that without the benefit of his father's friendships. Let's just be honest about that. And he would end up controlling purchasing the controlling interest of Columbia Trust. He would then name himself president, and then he would become officially the youngest bank president in the country at age 25. So as the head of Columbia Trust Bank, Kennedy worked hard to cultivate friendships with the super wealthy and those who owned big businesses and corporations. And he wasn't opposed to those who didn't have a huge income, but those that didn't have the size of that size of income were cultivated. So in other words, if you made a shitload of money, he wanted you. If you didn't make any money, it wasn't a bad thing as long as you had powerful political connections. So it's not like he said, nope, you don't got no money, I want nothing to do with you. He would take anybody as long as there was some sort of benefit to come his way. And his true personal beliefs were that those that were Boston's elite needed to be his. He needed their money. He wanted their money. And as I said, he wasn't opposed to the lower class because he would work with everybody, but upper class was really where he wanted to be. That was really his prime directive. And if they didn't have upper class sort of money, then he used people for political allies to get to the wealthy and the elite. So as he continued to bring in the wealthy and elite, they would talk to him about, taking over the Massachusetts Electric Company. And it was another idea which could propel Kennedy into the spotlight. Eventually, those friendships that he established would lead to his election by the Board of Trustees of the Massachusetts Electric Company. At the time, they were New England's leading electric company, and he would officially be named to that board on May 29th of 1917. And that day is very substantial because that's the day that JFK would be born. Now, one of the questions that you might have is, how the hell does a guy who's just a bank president suddenly take over an electric company? How does that happen? Like, aren't those two different things? Well, the bottom line is money and finances. If he's good at controlling finances, then why not? But I've often believed that there was a bigger reason for this. Because you just don't get that job because you own a bank. It's once again, using political allies, using people in big business gets him that position. And he would do that virtually his whole entire life, as it were. So with Joe's new allies and his friendships, it begins to pay off dividends for him. Kennedy would jump into the real estate game and then would buy distressed properties, fix them up, and sell them for a huge profit. But he kept a lot of those properties for himself. He would buy the Old Colony Realty Associates Incorporated, which specifically dealt with distressed real estate. And it was a pretty smart move. In 1917, a fellow board member a guy by the name of Guy Currier, who was a big-time lawyer in Boston, and he was also an acting lawyer for Bethlehem Steel, would recommend Joe Kennedy to Bethlehem Steel chief executive Charles Schwab, that might sound familiar, for the position of assistant general manager at the company's Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. So let me read that again. In 1917, a fellow board member of the electric company basically comes to him, a guy by the name of Guy Currier, and he was also a lawyer in Boston, but he was also an acting lawyer for Bethlehem Steel. Now, that's huge because I don't know if you guys know who owned Bethlehem Steel, but it was none other than Russell Bufalino. Those are just facts. Eventually, he would own that. Okay, so let's just keep that on the back burner. And he basically recommends Joe Kennedy to Charles Schwab as the position of assistant general manager for the company's Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. Once again, why on earth do you take a guy who owns a bank and put him in command of a shipyard? It doesn't make much sense. But once again, it's all about political advantages and allies. That shipyard specifically was one of the largest shipyards in the country at the time. And at the time, the shipyard was busy and booming with orders for steel, with the United States sort of getting ready to enter World War I. Next to Fore Shipyard was a secondary shipyard, which was being built in Squantum. And the idea was if Kennedy was overseeing things, then things would be kept under control and on time. So in other words, I think they valued his business acumen. But once again, how do you fucking get that position? To me, it's just odd. But once again, the explanation is simple. He's wealthy, he's powerful, he's got the right contacts, he's related to P.J. Kennedy. That's all it really takes. And it was through Fore Shipyard that he would end up meeting then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That relationship's going to be very important down the line. Him and Roosevelt didn't always get along. They had some knockdown, drag-out brawls on the shipyards. But war would eventually begin, and Kennedy just worked his ass off at the shipyard, making sure everything was sort of kept under control. And as the war comes to a close, Kennedy was fully exhausted, and he wanted out of the shipyard business. And what he does is he ends up venturing back towards finance, which was really, truly his strong suit. He ends up meeting and befriending a guy by the name of Galen Stone, who was an associate of the electric company and partner at a brokerage firm, which was Hayden Stone and Company. Stone would teach him, and this is why this is another interesting element. Galen Stone was a hedge fund guy, right? And he meets him through the electric company stuff. And what he ends up doing is he teaches Joe Kennedy how to handle stocks and bonds and basically takes him through a crash course of how stocks work. And Kennedy, who was absolutely unequivocally brilliant when it came to math, found a way to manipulate the markets, found a way to basically engage in stock fraud and insider trading and market manipulation. The amount of people who lost their entire life savings as a result of Kennedy's schemes was humongous. He was the Bernie Madoff of his day, okay? Complete and utter, truthfulness, okay? He made a fuck ton of money doing this, and he didn't give a fuck who was busted by it. And he gets away with this because at the time, the stock market was unregulated. So technically, he's really not doing anything illegal, right? But it's funny because down the line, who does the stock exchange put in charge of regulations? Joe Kennedy. Isn't that some shit? But we'll get to that probably next week. But like I said, it was unregulated, so technically he's not doing anything. But we can definitely argue the moral ambiguity about what he was doing and how that was not fucking cool. But he basically ruined businesses, bankrupted people, destroyed people's finances. It's basic theft is what he did. And that's all it was. And because Kennedy essentially owned banks, he didn't have to gamble with his own money when he did anything. Rather, he was gambling with the money of his clients. And there has been, over the years, a lot of talk about how Kennedy acquired many of his real estate holdings in those days because he didn't have liquid cash. A lot of it was real estate property and et cetera, right? So he wasn't totally loaded. I mean, he was loaded, but not like mega loaded. And I have some information sitting here right on the desk in front of me that might describe how he actually acquired a lot of these things without money. And to sum it up, without reading all the 20 pages of this FBI report, the FBI began looking into Kennedy because of his controlling interest in two banks and the amount of volume that he was procuring in real estate, because the numbers just didn't add up. And the FBI was looking at him, right? And keep in mind, he had money, but he was not uber wealthy at the time. And the FBI thought that he was using the bank's money to acquire these real estate deals. And he got lucky because they panned out for him. So in other words, he was taking money that technically belonged to the patrons of the bank, and he was using it to buy real estate and flip houses, but he was getting lucky because he was making money off of it. Imagine if, okay, let's say there's $100,000 in the bank. He takes $80,000 in that bank, which at the time would not have been federally insured whatsoever, and he loses all of it. Everybody's going to wonder where the fuck their money went. So that's basically what he did. Had he not made those profits, the banks would have had to close because he was using other people's money to purchase equity in homes, which is illegal. But once again, so the reports that I have detail his past, because even as late as January 16th of 1956, the FBI was still digging into his past. And we will probably get to those reports next week and the week after. We're going to have a lot of FBI paperwork, but it's an interesting look at how much the FBI knew. And then there's reasons why they were looking into it. And a lot of that's because he was gaining stature in political circles, and the FBI was a little leery of how he was making his money. And anytime you own two fucking banks and you're doing shady shit, the government's going to start to look, right? So Prohibition begins. As World War I ended, there was a lot of anti-immigrant shit going on, and the prohibitionists were pushing their narrative, and it began to gain steam. So much so that on January 16th of 1919, the 18th Amendment would become law under the 36th state legislature, and Utah would ratify that. The amendment would come into law exactly 1 year later. Before that could happen, though, Congress had to pass a federal statute to implement the 18th Amendment with a legal process for banning the sales, distribution, and transportation of alcohol of no more than 0.5% alcohol content, and a bureau of federal agents to enforce it. So they had to hire federal agents to sort of do that kind of stuff. So this act, or the National Prohibition Act, would be drafted, and the act would be named the Volstead Act. And that was the nation's new law prohibiting alcohol, and that commenced as mandated on January 17th of 1920. Violations could mean fines up to $1,000 in months or years behind bars. America's 13-year prohibition era had officially begun. So one of the things that we have to discuss is bootlegging. And you know that's where we're going. Now, if you buy the Kennedys' narrative, Joe was never involved in bootlegging, and he was often confused with another Joe Kennedy who was a bootlegger from Canada. Authors have tried to say over the decades that people got it wrong, but when you have the likes of Frank Costello, Longies Willman, Bill Dwyer, Joe Bonanno, and others saying that Joe Kennedy was in fact involved in bootlegging, and then they actually went into somewhat detailed information on it, I tend to believe where there is smoke, there is fire. Now, can I present you with a paper with certifiable proof? No. However, the long denial of the Kennedy family over Mafia ties can easily be proven with a few keys and a couple of clicks. In Joe Bonanno's book, there's a photo of him with Joe Kennedy. So to say that that the Kennedys didn't know anybody on that side of the fence is completely obliterated by photos. Those are just facts. Now, while there was another Joe Kennedy from Canada who was a bootlegger, those are facts. It doesn't mean that our Joe Kennedy was not involved. And there are some facts that we're going to discuss, which I think won't 100% unequivocally prove it. But there's enough to sort of cast a huge shadow and doubt onto Joe Kennedy and some of his dealings. Think about it. And this is just an observation. If Joe Kennedy didn't know mafia guys, didn't know gangsters, how does he ever approach Frank Sinatra in the first place to talk to Sam Giancana and others to help with the election? That just kind of refutes everything right there. Now, surely Kennedy could have gone to them himself, and he did many times, but he used Frank Sinatra as the middleman, gave him plausible deniability in every sense. The fact is, Joe Kennedy knew these unsavory characters very well, and he had the one thing that the mob needed at that time: inroads into Canadian companies. Remember Joe's dad? He established those routes. We talked about that last week. Decades before, he began to import Canadian whiskey and from South America. And he did that before Prohibition. And that company was never, ever sold. And with access to boats and ships and businesses, Kennedy would become a major player in the bootlegging trade. But as I said, I cannot give you much more than circumstantial evidence. But it's ironic that one of the ports that was used by the mob to smuggle booze was Nantucket. And it's ironic that ships controlled by Kennedy came to the Lower East Side of New York City late at night during those years. It's also ironic that Kennedy-owned whiskey companies continued to bring in whiskey to the country more than the allowed weight and content. It's ironic that places like the Stork Club served Joe Kennedy-owned whiskey and liquor. So Joe Kennedy somehow, and I'm not sure how he acquired it, but there was a loophole within the Volstead Act that allowed for medicinal alcohol for religious purposes. It gave Kennedy basically the green light to import liquor legally. And that was a huge thing for organized crime because it meant if shipments got stopped, which was very rare, it was all legit on paper. And it was controlled and legally acquired by Joe Kennedy. If that's not enough, we're going to talk about a hijacking where a Kennedy-owned liquor shipment was stolen and 10 men who were guarding it got murdered. And Kennedy was irate and called his business partners, Meyer Lansky, Longies Willman, and others, and they fired back. So we will get to that little part here in a minute, but there is enough to substantiate the claims that members of the Kennedys and listen, to be fully transparent, Gore Vidal, who is Jackie Kennedy's stepbrother, who made no bones about disliking the Kennedys, repeatedly told stories that Joe Kennedy was a gangster and he made millions and millions in the booze business. And the question you're going to ask is because, you know, it's what I thought about at first too. Well, there has to be bank records or something to show a loss or some sort of insurance claim, something that could point to some sort of backdoor deal. But when you control the fucking bank, like Columbia Trust, you control everything. But for some reason, 10 years of statements at that bank go missing during the time period of Prohibition. You have to begin to kind of scratch your head a little bit. If the Kennedy Library has all the bank statements and more from that time period, why is a decade missing? And it's just one of 12 dozen instances of stuff being hidden. So where do we begin? As we know, like I stated before, doctors were able to acquire whiskey through prescriptions, and those would come from government-licensed distilleries. Wine was used to treat ailments, but you were allotted one pint every 10 days, okay? 1 pint. Because in a minute, I'm going to tell you barrels. There's a big difference between a barrel and a pint, okay? So they were allotted 1 pint every 10 days. The law also, so let's see. So if they're allowed 1 pint every 10 days, that's 3 pints a month. 3 pints, not barrels. The law also allowed for the manufacturing and sale of wine to be used in sacraments or religious rituals by rabbis, priests, and etc. These loopholes obviously would get abused. Doctors, were on the take, as you might assume and suspect. Doctors and pharmacists made a killing issuing the expensive prescriptions to patients with colds and sore throats. Got a cold, got a sore throat, go get a pint of whiskey. That's just what they did. Now, distillers who had the government license were making an absolute fucking killing. There was one exception to the Volstead Act, however, and that was in October of 1920 when the Treasury Department issued a statement clarifying that Section 29 of the Volstead Act concerning the manufacturing of fruit juices, you guys are going to love this. Section 29 of the Volstead Act concerned the manufacturing of fruit juices at home without a federal permit. The statement specifically addressed winemaking. the head of a family who has properly registered may make 200 gallons of wine for family use without payment of tax. That meant that families could generate but not sell or transport the equivalent of 1,000 bottles of wine a year or 2.7 bottles per day for home consumption without paying taxes. Yeah, I'm going to make 200 gallons of wine. We drink a lot over here, baby. And you think those pricks weren't moving it out the back? Okay. So that regulation led to a nationwide surge in home winemaking. Everybody said, oh, we can make it. Fuck it. We're going to do it. So from 1925 to 1929, 679 million gallons of homemade wine passed through the lips of Americans, tripling the amount that they drank in the 5 years leading up to Prohibition. The acreage farmers in California devoted to growing wine grapes expanded from, you ready for this, 97,000 to 681,000. The price for a ton of grapes was only $9.50 a ton of grapes. $9.50 in 1919 rose to $375 a ton by 1924. So with everybody making money, organized crime is really not far behind. So while we could talk about Al Capone and his massive bootlegging operations, we could talk about Bugsy Moran and his bootlegging operations, the reality is none of these guys would have been able to get that deep into the industry if not for Abner Longies Willman, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and Joe Kennedy. Carlo Gambino, for example, got involved in bootlegging, but was smart enough to open a distillery in South Philadelphia with Angelo Bruno. Dutch Schultz, who was also steep into bootlegging, was intelligent enough to realize that if he manufactured it, not only could he control his own action, but he'd make quadruple the profits. And that's what Schultz does. He heads to upstate New York, builds underground distilleries, and makes his product. And he basically owns the fucking town. But everyone on the he put everybody in the town on the payroll, so nobody ever uttered a fucking word. Even if Schultz was manufacturing booze or bathtub gin, he still had to get products from Canada and from Europe through Canada. And there was a premium price on whiskey. So who controlled the whiskey? Easy. Joe Kennedy. Remember we discussed in week 1 with PJ Kennedy and how he bought into Canadian whiskey companies and how he basically transferred those companies into exports. Well, it would have been imports. Well, somehow Joe Kennedy managed to acquire a fucking medicinal license from the government to import whiskey. He's not a doctor. How the fuck does he get a license? Well, he gets a license because he knows the right people. But because Kennedy had the ships, he was the guy who could really help the mob out if anybody was looking to import liquor and wine and anything else. And the mob knew it. Further proving that Kennedy was involved was the fact that Oni Madden, who owned the infamous Harlem Cotton Club, was selling Kennedy-owned liquor during Prohibition. How is that possible? How could Kennedy sell owned liquor if he's not involved? Big Bill Dwyer, who was a gangster, brought up in Hell's Kitchen. He was running a huge illegal distillery called Phoenix Brewery, which was located on 26th Street here in Manhattan. And while Dwyer knew he could make millions just from illegal beer, he also knew that liquor from Europe and Canada was something that he desperately needed. And rather than fight everybody else, he decides to partner up. He would partner up with Frank Costello, Oni Madden, and everybody else. And they wanted to begin to import illegal liquor and etc. And with Dwyer owning several trucks and warehouses, they have the means now. They can put stuff places, but they need a contact. They have to get it here. So in the mid-1920s, Dwyer ends up heading to prison, believe it or not, which is when Longies Willman, New Jersey gangster, gets involved. A guy by the name of Joseph Reinfeld would also join the fold, and it would become the Reinfeld-Costello rum routes. Joe Kennedy, for example, as you know, he had ships, massive cargo ships, and he would use those to facilitate his shipments of illegal booze. But remember, he had a federal license to do it. And what the mob needed was a front, somebody who could bring it over legally for a price. And those shipments needed to be protected from the Coast Guard and the federal government. And the best case scenario for the Mafia was finding a front, and that came in the form of Joe Kennedy. The boys had established routes for rum running. They had plotted 3 destinations in America, one off Nantucket, where Kennedy had boats that entered and left nonstop, Long Island, somewhere else in Long Island, over here on the Lower East Side. There were Kennedy-owned ships that would show up, like I told you earlier, right over here, a block from me on the Lower East Side. But they would show up in the middle of the night where trucks would be waiting in the darkness. And those are just facts. That's true. The secondary problem that the Mafia had was paying off those who could make waves and make problems. And that included the cops, and that included Tammany Hall. Kennedy had a lot of power, and he helped the mob contact the right people, and then Costello would bribe and pay them off to acquire their silence, to mind their business. Usually cops would take cash, or they would take a couple of pints of booze. The Fulton Fish Market, which is right over here on the East River, a couple blocks over from me, at night had large lots that were vacant, and that was used as a drop-off point. But like I said, Kennedy, who had a license, basically got the ships into the port unobstructed. But the Mafia had to handle everything else from there. I can get it to you, but you got to handle the distribution. And things were all systems go. And New York would ensure that speakeasies were controlled and that the Midwest mobsters got their share of alcohol as well, as Detroit was a huge player in that too. The Costellos, Willman, Kennedy, Reinfeld operation controlled the largest ship smuggling venture on the East Coast. What's interesting is Kennedy's Somerset Limited was formed, strangely, 1 month before the Volstead Act was repealed. However, in a search of the Kennedy Library proves that in his business papers that Somerset was active well before that. In fact, those papers show that they were acted and transferred in the name from P.J. Kennedy to Joseph Kennedy Limited, literally 1 week before the Volstead Act kicked in. Okay, so that's just not coincidence. Kennedy, under questioning in the 1950s, refused to answer questions as to whether he had government permits to import medicinal liquor. So here's the thing, and I have the government questions here, which I'll probably get to next week. He's refusing to answer that. Well, if you had the government permits, what the fuck do you care? Because legitimately you're doing the right thing, right? So there would be no problem in answering that question, but he doesn't. And he doesn't for a good reason, because he doesn't want anybody to know how much he was really bringing in. Because once again, you could only bring in a certain amount. And the reason why it's important is because under the medical laws, he could have basically brought in pretty much as he wanted, but he would have had to forge ship logs to show where the liquor was going. And just for insurance purposes alone, those logs would be important in case, a ship sinks at sea. And pundits will argue that this is why Kennedy was not involved, and that's why they used the argument that Somerset was fairly new and they wouldn't have had time to plan routes or a distribution plan. But it's like, I argue that because it's totally invalid. Kennedy worked at shipyards. He knew how everything functioned. He knew how everything worked. He wouldn't have had to do anything but fucking import this shit, and the mob was going to handle everything else. The mob had already the distribution network set up. It was good to go. And Kennedy had at least allegedly, the legit medicinal purposes to do it. It's not rocket science. Costello, in fact, decades later, would tell people Joe Kennedy was active and involved in the entire operation. But Kennedy had the right contacts and literally didn't have anything to be concerned with. The worst case scenario for him is ship sinks and he collects insurance on it. And I can't tell you what year this was, nor can I show you proof, but underworld sources told the FBI that there was a Kennedy-owned shipment that was heading for Nantucket. That shipment was owned by Kennedy, and when the shipment arrived, the guys were late picking it up. So they left 10 guys to guard the shipment. Trucks were en route. What ends up happening is that trucks show up and all 10 guys get murdered and tossed into the river. The story was, you ready for this? The story was mentioned in the biography of Meyer Lansky and Longie's Willman, and the source of that story came from Doc Stacher, who was in Lansky's crew. And what makes that robbery/hit interesting is where it happened. Nantucket is where Kennedy basically had his ships coming in to deliver booze. one of the places. Turns out, Meyer Lansky, according to Doc Stature, had ordered the shipment to be robbed and wanted everybody killed on site. Now, while nothing substantial got reported about it to the press, a lot of people over the years did some digging, because I'm always, clear cut with you guys. And people looked deep into the business papers of Kennedy, but surely the loss financially would have been recorded somewhere, right? But a deep search of those records proved to be null and void. And the reason for that was because Kennedy was the chairman of the board of his own fucking bank. So he basically buried the loss financially. However, there is an odd addition to his account which shows an insurance coverage loss in which he received money for lost goods around the same time that this event happened. So it looks more like an insurance scam than anything else. So when I searched myself into the Kennedy Library, I was able to find that at the beginning of the Prohibition, this is big, the bank owned over 100 barrels of whiskey and rum under the accounts receivable account. According to the records, these barrels were stored in warehouses in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. And you have to kind of ask yourself, why on fucking God's green earth would you store barrels in 3 states? Especially, coincidentally, when those 3 states are major hubs of distribution points with Costello's group. Chicago, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. It makes no sense. Why not just store all 100 barrels in the same goddamn place? And no answer has ever been given for why those barrels were stored there. Coincidence? Or was it just leftover barrels from PJ's alcohol company, which they couldn't move because of Prohibition? Like many of the authors and Kennedy lovers have said, the fact that Joe Kennedy had all of the permits, meant they were not leftovers at all. Because he had the permits to do basically what he wanted, that's a lot of barrels of booze. So that argument kind of falls flat. So I found another piece of evidence, which was dated right in the middle of Prohibition. The Kennedy Bank acquired 1,000 barrels of whiskey. However, there are no invoices, and there are no invoices that showed how they acquired 1,000 barrels, which were stored, you ready for this, in Quincy Cold Storage Warehouse on the Boston Harbor, which Kennedy owned. Letters, ready for this, letters from a Fitzgerald in-law to Joseph Kennedy show that in 1933, the writer of that letter reminds Kennedy of a quote-unquote sale that he helped broker with quote-unquote our friends, but that nobody else was able to move them without our friends because they are smuggled into Boston and people were getting leery. Ding, 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 ding. Do you need more evidence? It's also worth noting that Fitzgerald was the uncle of Kennedy's wife, and he was running several speakeasies himself. One was behind a local drugstore of Rouse Wharf in Boston, right on the harbor. If anyone would have known what was being smuggled and how, it was Fitzgerald. And his terminology in that letter all but fucking proves that Joe Kennedy was deeply involved in moving bootleg liquor. The facts are just right there. So it's also somewhat coincidental that narcotics became another source that was moving through those same exact shipping lanes. The same ships were used. Now, while I can't 100% prove to you that Kennedy actively supported narcotics trafficking, what I can say without hesitation to you is that the manifestos on his ships were always incomplete and inaccurate. The Kennedys, for their part, have always denied that Joe had any business ties to the Mafia, no ties to bootlegging. However, there are photos of Kennedy with Joe Bonanno prior to John F. Kennedy running for office, as Kennedy took a meeting with Bonanno in Arizona to ensure those votes. It's also worth noting that Kennedy was constantly seen having lunch and dinner with Frank Costello in New York. So all the denials the Kennedys didn't know them, and this is crazy, or that the Kennedys were somehow not involved in any unsavory acts is a bit ludicrous to me, to be honest with you. The reality will be, as we will show you in the coming weeks, the Kennedy would use those allies down the road to help acquire votes for his son. Kennedy, if he didn't know them, would have never been able to request the help of them. He wouldn't have anything to do with them unless, of course, there was a history between them, albeit a working relationship, if you will. So, when we come back next week, we're going to see how Joe Kennedy suddenly, after Prohibition, becomes suddenly fucking wealthy. and how the stock market crash, he somehow is not destroyed by that. Rather, he gained a tremendous amount of wealth because of the crash. We will also see how he gets himself into the Maritimes and ends up controlling the fucking ports and the unions. And that's going to come in handy, especially when you consider that drugs are about to be the biggest fucking import the American Mafia has ever gotten involved in. If you control politics and you control politicians, you control maritime ventures, you are the fucking gatekeeper of the castle. Everything goes through you. And you might ask yourself, how does a finance guy, ordinary by most stretches of the imagination, get these types of positions? It's not what you know. It's who you know. Which favors you can give, which favors you can accept. Kennedy was for sale and everybody knew it. Kennedy is also going to suddenly, for no fucking explanation at all, get into the movie business, which at the time was dying out. Kennedy would take over RKO, which was a movie studio, and somehow, despite all odds against everything made, he would make millions on grade B films. When Hollywood was struggling at the time, Kennedy was the only one who seems to succeed. Is it luck? Is he that bright that he can forecast trends in finances? Or is it something more? I can promise you, this is not the story of the goose that laid the golden egg, but more so about the farmer who overtakes everything by power. And I want to leave you with this question to think about for the next week. In the days where Hollywood was hurting to turn a huge profit, they weren't making much money. How on earth would a guy with zero film acumen purchase a film studio, make hundreds of B movies, which were all in those days considered independent features, and makes millions upon millions upon millions? B movies were not trending. They were not making profits. Regular Hollywood wasn't. And independent films at the time were considered barren knockoffs, unfruitful, and not even competitive with major markets or studios. But somehow Joe Kennedy is the guy that somehow beats those odds again. There is much more to it than you would ever fucking know. So come back next week as we continue to talk about the rise of Joe Kennedy. And we're going to show you some things, talk about some things that are going to blow your fucking mind. So do me a solid, as you do all the time. Tell everybody about the show. Also, reach out to us at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. Let me know what you think about the Kennedy shows. Are you learning something? Is it exciting enough? Is there aspects you want me to cover? Just let me know. Reach out. Have a great weekend. Be safe. Be kind to one another.